Hi, I'm Matt. I tweet as WMILTTI, why must I lose to this idiot, on Twitter. Uh, just following a couple of requests, I've posted over the past few months a few games that I've played uh, against the French defence using the lines in the Chessable French Toast book or course. So I wanted to do a brief course review, set out some of the key ideas behind it, and just talk through why I like the course. You'll see that Pentala Harikrishna, who was the author of the course, has also done a video on Chessable, so very much recommend you go and watch that as well. But yeah, I wanted to talk through sort of from the point of view of the consumer, the target audience, why I think it's a very good course. So I'm roughly a 2000 FIDE strength player. I've played 1e4 and the French defence as black all my chess playing life, and I've really struggled to find a system that I was happy with against the French. I've tried all sorts of things. I've tried the advanced variation, I've tried the Winnower, I've tried the Tarrasch, and nothing was quite working. I guess because I play it as black, I find that some of the lines that I'm playing as white, I'm sort of comfortable with the positions that my opponent is getting, and I'm not really keen on that. This is slightly different because it's not going down the absolute main lines. It's based on solid principles. If black plays well, then white tends to get a reasonably comfortable position, and we'll see a couple of those when I go through. And if black plays badly, we'll see a couple of those as well. It can go wrong very fast, and there are lots of ways to go wrong that are set out in the course. The other thing I really like about it is that it's not particularly well-known lines against the French. As I say, I've played the French defence 20 plus years. I don't think anyone has ever played these lines against me. So it tends to be something that people will not be that well prepared against. But even if they are, you'll still get a decent position. So let's have a quick look at some lines and also some games that I played in those lines. So if we start with we start here. So the idea is that we play e4, e6, d4, d5, and we play knight c3. Now, black has two main options against knight c3. First is bishop to b4, which we'll look at right now, and the second is knight to f6, which we'll look at in a minute. So bishop b4. The main line, and this is the winnower, is e5. And black plays c5, hitting at d4, a3, takes, knight e7, queen g4. There are other lines for both white and for black, but this is kind of the standard poison pawn main line, queen c7, queen takes pawn, and you get all sorts of craziness. And I do quite have a bit of a soft spot for this. I played it as a kid, but I'm finding more and more that people know these lines, even at my level, so 2000, 2100. You'll come across people that know this stuff down to move 20, move 25, and when people know the opening that well, it's really hard to get any sort of advantage against them. So yeah, whilst I quite like these positions, it wasn't something that I was comfortable going into if there was a risk that my opponent would be massively well prepared. The French toast lines vary from the winnower very early. So you play e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, and now you play e takes d5. And typically black will retake with the pawn. And some people might say, well, that's just the exchange French, to which I would say sort of, but not quite, because in the exchange French, after d5, white takes ed5 straight away, and then ed5. And to get to the French toast lines from here, you have to go knight c3 and bishop b4. Well, actually no one plays knight c3 in the exchange French, and even when they do, no one plays bishop b4 straight after. So generally in the exchange you get either knight f3 or reasonably often bishop d3. But yeah, knight c3 really isn't a common move at all against the exchange. So yes, it is sort of an exchange French, but equally it has its own flavour. It's a little bit different. So takes. One thing to just mention, black doesn't have to take with the pawn. So the knight's pinned, so black can safely take the pawn on d5. I just wanted to show this line. So this is sort of okay for black at the moment, but there are ways to go very wrong very early. Let's have a look at one of them. So white plays knight to f3, knight f6, bishop d3, and black's eyes light up because black can play knight to e4, threatening to take this knight twice, taking advantage again of this pin on the knight on c3, and white just ignores castles. So now threatening to take both the knight and the queen. So black has to go in, takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, rook b1. And now white is arguing that there is more than enough compensation for that missing b2 pawn because black hasn't developed any of his queenside. That bishop on c8 is going to take a while to come out because it's hitting at e6. And yeah, in this particular example, black doesn't last very much longer. So the sort of stereotyped castles seems a sensible developing move, but it is already lost. Rook b3, bishop a5, and then the classic move against the French and other openings when you haven't got anything defending the king, bishop h7, classic Greek gift sacrifice, king h7, knight g5, king g8, queen h5, only way to stop it, queen f5, rook h3, and that is going to be checkmate. So yeah, as I say, if you don't know what you're doing as black, watch out. Pawn takes, pawn. Let's go back to move 4 and look at pawn takes. So now bishop to d3. The idea generally is to point your pieces at the black king side, and the coloured arrows show the options and for black and what white should do against them. So the options really are the main ones: knight c6, knight f6, knight e7. If you play knight c6, you play knight f3, and if you play the other knight out, so knight e7, white plays knight to f3. If knight to f6, then white plays knight to e2 as per the coloured arrows. It's fairly simple rule of thumb. You do the opposite of what your opponent does. So if he goes f6, you go e2. If he goes e7, you go f3. Here's a quick example of knight f6. So knight e2 as promised. Then the next couple of moves, fairly simple for white. You castle and you play bishop f4. The black castles, white castles, rook e8, pawn to a3, kicking the bishop out of the way, bishop back to d6, bishop f4, challenging it, and that knight that's come to e2 is helpful, defending the bishop on f4. Bishop g4 is a move. One thing to point out, this position has been reached in top level chess, and against Harikrishna, Caruana played c6. Harry played h3, knight e4, bishop e4, de4. The game was eventually drawn, but actually the computer very much likes white here. It's giving a +1 because this e4 pawn is fairly weak. These bishops will come off, and white is a bit better. So going back, bishop to g4. This is just sort of showing a line from the book, showing how sort of detailed it is. Queen d2. So you can almost stop here as white. You can just say, well, my position is fine. I've developed all my pieces. I know roughly what I'm doing, but yeah, he goes a little bit further. Bishop e2, knight e2, knight to e4, queen to a5, hitting d5, knight back, bishop, queen, queen to b4, and points out that you're more than happy as white to let black take off the queens on the basis that you have an open a file. You can expand quite nicely on the king side, and whilst black's not doing too badly, clearly white is a little bit better. So as I mentioned, if black plays sensibly, then that's fine. White just ends up with a reasonably comfortable game. So if we just look at a very quick game that I actually played in this particular line, e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, takes. This is a blitz game I played a little while ago. Bishop d3, knight comes to e7, so knight to f3, knight to c6, threatening maybe to take this d pawn here. Now he's pinned me. So h3, kicking the bishop. I had someone actually today be a little bit greedy and take on f3, queen to f3, knight takes d4. But already white's actually doing well here after queen to g4. I'm going to take on g7, and you can't stop me because, I mean, my opponent actually played the terrible knight e6 and just dropped this bishop on b4. But even if you don't do that, you can play bishop c3, pawn c3, knight e6. But already after f4, black's position is, despite the extra pawn, is kind of on the verge of falling apart. So if we go back to the line that we played before, so bishop to g4, h3. So in this particular game, my opponent played bishop to h5. I played a3, kicking the other bishop, bishop to d6, now rook to e1. So here, if you take the d pawn, I can play pawn to g4. And my opponent castled, but here another Greek gift. Takes, knight g5, threatening to take the bishop on h5 with the queen. So king to g6, now g4, trapping the bishop, and rook to h1, and now this is checkmate. Queen d3. If you play king to f6, then this is quite cute. Knight h7, rook h7, and g5 lands. And instead, my opponent played f5, and rook e6 was checkmate. So again, fun little line showing that black can go very wrong very quickly. The other line, as I mentioned, was the knight f6 line, so e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6 instead of bishop b4. So this is the other kind of main line in the French. This is the classical. This is actually what I play as black. And the main line, nearly everybody plays it like this. e5, knight to d7, f4, c5, knight f3, and then again there's slightly different lines, but this is the sort of position you end up in. So black has some trouble with this c8 bishop here, but has advanced up on the queen side and got a reasonable position. It's sort of playable for both sides here, and I'm reasonably happy playing this as white actually, but I quite like these other lines that Harikrishna's put together. So the French toast way of playing is this: e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, e5, knight d7, and now white follows suit, knight ce2. And I wanted just to go on a little digression here. Another reason why I quite like these lines is that they look quite similar to other lines that you play as white, but actually the way that black needs to play against them is slightly different, and I think this can confuse even pretty strong French defense players. So in the French Tarrasch, you get some fairly similar positions. So you get knight to e2, knight to d2, sorry, instead of knight to c3, knight f6, e5, knight to d7, c3, c5, bishop d3, knight c6, knight to e2, and because your other knight is coming to f3, takes, f6, knight f4, threatening the pawn on e6, and here you can play knight takes d4, and you're defending the e6 pawn, because nothing's defending that d4 pawn. And this is actually quite a main line in this variation of the Tarrasch, and the king is pretty safe on e7. So yeah, I mean, this has been played 400 odd times, so it's something that people are playing and have played for 20 odd years. But you'll see you get a fairly similar position in these French toast lines. Knight back. But here you're putting different knights on different squares. So you've already got the knight on e2 instead of one on d2. Knight c6, knight f3, takes, now f6. Now you can play knight f4, which is quite similar to what we had before, except that in the other position we had a bishop on d3 and we had a knight on d2, which makes it look similar but act quite different. And here the line that's given, and this is a long line and another example of how in depth Harikrishna has gone to produce this repertoire. Bishop b4, bishop d2, takes, queen e7 to defend the e6 pawn, pawn takes, knight takes, bishop to b5, knight to e4, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen a5, and white is a little better here, and the reason white is a little better here is because this bishop can't go anywhere. So queen a5 was to stop it from coming out to a6. Castles, and now white's going to bring the f4 knight background into e5 to stop black from ever playing e5. Knight d3. So black in this line goes for it and says, well, I'm going to play e5 as a sacrifice because I've got pressure on f2. Queen g5. And here the recommended line is castles, which looks very scary. Bishop h3, threatening checkmate on g2. Knight to e1. Knight to d2, winning the exchange. Queen back. Knight takes. Queen takes. Queen to f6. Knight to d3. Knight has to come back out. Rook c1. Knight back to e4, threatening f2, and rook c2. And here, white is in exchange for a pawn down, but has an absolute monster knight on e5 that black's never ever going to be able to challenge. White's already threatening knight d7, white's threatening queen d7 possibly, white's threatening rook takes c6. Black actually struggles here to find a sensible plan and even a sensible move in this position. Despite the material disadvantage, the computer gives a small edge to white. And again, this is up to move 24, so this is showing sort of how much work has gone into this repertoire, and yeah, finding interesting and playable positions for the white pieces. So finally, I just wanted to show you a quick game against that I played. This is a little while back in one of these lines against someone. I think his official title is internet chess legend MrDodgy, and managed to beat him in this game. Although I think the bragging rights are still with him, as I think he's beaten me in nearly every other game we've played. But yeah, this was quite a nice example of what happens, how black can go wrong in this particular line. So e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, e5, knight back, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, f6. So it's quite similar to what we played before, but without pawn takes pawn. Now knight f4. Already this is actually quite awkward for black, so he has to play queen e7 really here. My opponent played knight b6. I played bishop d3. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. f5. So here I played h4 because I want to play knight to g5, threatening this pawn again. g6. Knight g5 as advertised, threatening e6. Queen e7, defending. Bishop e3, defending on d4. Queen across to g7. Here I played h5. Computer actually wants to blow everything completely apart with g4, but h5 works. My idea just to clear everything up on the king side. Bishop b4 check doesn't help. I just played king f1. Queen came across to e7, threatening the knight on g5, but here pawn takes pawn, so he can't take the pawn back because of the pin on the rook. So queen takes knight, but now rook takes h7, and the problem is that I'm threatening to take the rook, and if you change the rook, you can't stop the pawn from queening. So if you play queen h6, I can just play queen h5 check, queen takes h5, knight takes h5, and there's no stopping h8 equals queen. So my opponent actually played bishop d7, but then h8 equals queen just wins straight away. So to summarize, yeah, I think that the French toast lines are very interesting, very playable for white, very different from what most French players have seen before, and definitely it's worth investing in, or at least taking a look at Harikrishna's course. So I hope you enjoyed my video, and thanks for watching.